Sooner or later, when it comes to deployment and hosting, you will run into needing to package your Nuxt application into a container. This is necessary when deploying to any container hosting service such as Amazon Kubernetes Service or AKS, Amazon EKS, Azure Container Apps or AWS Beanstalk. Let's go and see how we can stuff our Nuxt application into a Docker container. Good morning, good afternoon or good evening, whenever it is that I find you, and welcome along to the channel. So today we're talking about putting your SPA into a Docker container. And the SPA in our case is a Nuxt3 application. And we've got some options in this regard as to how we can package our Nuxt application up. What we can do is we can package our Nuxt application with a .NET API. And I've got a previous tutorial where I've shown how Visual Studio 2022 allows you to deal with building a Nuxt application with a .NET API. And essentially what this does is this uses the Kestrel web server to serve out your Nuxt application. So there's some things to consider when taking this approach. Your Nuxt app is client rendered, so you're going to use the static rendering approach. So this may not be so good where SEO is important to your application. And you've also got a language mix here. So obviously you need to understand about C# and .NET, as well as for your Nuxt application, you need to understand about JavaScript or TypeScript. So conversely, if we move over, we can also host this just within Node. And this uses Vite as the web server to expose this out. And this approach supports both server-side rendering and universal rendering. So this means that for SEO type scenarios, when the user lands on your page, the SEO robot would get a fully rendered page with content within it, as opposed to just a placeholder where the actual Nuxt application or Vue application is going to run. So that has some advantages there. And also we're doing full stack top to bottom in just JavaScript or TypeScript, whichever is your preference. So it's a simpler approach compared to the .NET approach, but it's just to show that there are options here. So we're going to look at both of these options in this video. So here we are on my development server, and I've got a WSL, so Windows Subsystem for Linux instance open. And if you want to see how I've set up my Windows Subsystem for Linux and Docker, I've got a video on that as well. So I'll put a link in the description for how you can go and set up this environment so that it matches mine if you're interested in that. But inside this folder, what I've got is a Nuxt3 ASP.NET application. So if I CD into that, we can go and see what that looks like. And this follows on from the previous tutorial on this, where this particular Nuxt3 ASP.NET is built using Visual Studio 2022 and packages your Nuxt3 application into a .NET API, minimal API basically. Let's just do this the easy way and open up VS Code. So I've got a front end and a back end and my solution file for Visual Studio. So inside my front end is where I've created my Nuxt3 application, and inside the back end is where my .NET API code is essentially. And if we just go and look in the release folder for when I published this, you can see that inside the publish folder, as well as the built executable or DLL, etc., there is a www root, and inside that folder is where your Nuxt application gets copied to. So that's how it all gets packaged. And so what we're going to do is containerize this back end into a Docker container so that it will contain our Nuxt application inside this www root folder, and then we can run this container using .NET to execute that and serve that out through the Kestrel web server. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside this root folder here, I'm going to create a new file and create a Docker ignore file. And the reason I'm creating it at the root level is because this is going to be where Docker runs essentially. This is going to be the Docker context. It's going to run at the root level so that it's got access to both the front end and the back end code and applications for when I run my Docker file. I need access to both of those so that I can copy the front end into the back end so that it can be part of that www root folder. So as part of that, when it's doing its copies, it's typical that you have a docker ignore so that you can specify folders and files and things like that, like you do with a git ignore, that you want to docker to ignore basically. So I'm going to copy in some bits into here. So I'm basically saying in any subfolder off of this particular, from where this file sits, then ignore these particular things. So ignore any node modules folders, ignore any Nuxt folder, ignore any .output folder. And all of this has come from a default node Nuxt file that I found. So if you Google for docker ignore Nuxt or Nuxt3, you'll come across something similar to this. So all I've done to that is add in these stars to make it ignore anything in any subfolder, because I want it to ignore it from the front end. And then likewise with a C# docker ignore as well, I've done exactly the same again. So Google for C# docker ignore and you'll get a file that looks like this. And then I've just gone through and added in the star so that it will ignore all of these in the backend folder. So that gives us our docker ignore. And then inside the backend, I'm going to create a Docker file, and this is where our actual Docker information about how to build our container is going to live. So if you're not familiar with Docker and Docker files, then you typically use a Docker file, and it can be named whatever, but by default it's called Docker file, and that's what Docker will look for when you run the command line. So I'll put some comments in at the top just so that people that get access to this repository know how to actually run this. So as it says, run this from the parent folder essentially, and you can use it using docker build, specify the backend Docker file, which is where this file now lives in backend, give the container a tag, so name it, and then specify the current folder. So you'd be in the root Nuxt3 ASP.NET folder as the Docker context, as I said. So it's got access to both the front end and the back end folders. And then this command is how you can actually run that container once it's been built. So let's step through what we're going to actually do to build this container. And most of this is standard boilerplate stuff from building .NET containers. So there is a container that you use as the base, and that exposes out. It's expecting your app to live in /app, and you're exposing out on port 80 and port 443. So then we're going to have a step that builds our backend. So again, this is standard, pretty standard .NET build stuff. So we're going to use .NET 7. We're going to set our working directory inside our container to the source folder. We're going to copy our backend CS proj into backend, so it will be in /source/backend. We then run a .NET restore against that backend CS proj. We then change our working directory so that we're inside of that backend. We then copy our backend folder and we copy everything from there then into the container, and then we do a .NET build, and that gets output into app build. Then we can think about how we build our front end. So our front end is obviously Node, so we're going to use the Alpine container and just label that as front end so that we can reference that from other steps. We're going to set our working directory inside that container to home node app, copy our package.json and our package lock.json, as is a best practice to copy that for speed purposes, and we'll just put that into the root of our context, which means it would go into this particular home node app folder. So we finish up with our package and package lock JSON files inside that folder. We can then do an npm install, which will go and install all of our dependent packages. Then we can copy the rest of our Nuxt application into that same folder, and then we can do an npm run generate so that we generate our static web app files. So that would go into our .output folder, as is typically the case with Nuxt3. So once we've built our front end, the next thing we need to do is assemble the bits together. So we need to push our front end built application from our .output folder essentially across to that www root folder. So this is saying from build and relabel it as publish. We do a .NET publish, so we create our published backend API. and that goes into an app publish folder. So this again is a standard step that you do when you're releasing .NET. And then we add in this step. So from our front end container, we go to the home node app.output.public folder, and we copy that to the app publish ww root. So that essentially then would give us something that mimics what we're seeing here with a publish folder with all of the .NET built components, and we're then copying our Nuxt application into the ww root folder that sits inside of that publish folder. So the final thing that we need to do is just to produce the final container. So inside here, we use the base container, which we get up here, and we use that to create a final container. So again, it's another container. We set the /app folder as our context, and then we copy from our published container from the app publish folder into the /app folder. So we've copied everything that we published inside this publish container across to this particular container, and then we set the entry point to be our DLL that we built as part of our API. So our API and our CS proj builds a backend.dll. As we can see in our publish directory, we get a backend.dll, and so that becomes our entry point. We just run .NET backend.dll and starts being able to serve our Nuxt application. So let's save this, jump back over to our Ubuntu terminal, and let's do exactly that command that I pasted in at the top of the Docker file. So we're in the root of our folder, and we're going to ask Docker to build our Docker file. So let's go and do that. So we've pulled our containers, and yours may take a bit longer than this because it might have to pull some of these containers down from the Docker registry. So we'll just let that run through. And we can see here that we're getting a warning about the referenced project from our backend. The ES_proj does not exist inside of this container, and that's because we haven't copied that across. So that's perfectly acceptable because that's the manual step that we're doing, where we're building our Nuxt application and copying that across to the www root. That's what this referenced project would do for you inside of Visual Studio. So the fact that you're seeing that warning means that this Docker file will work happily within Visual Studio. It won't break anything that you're doing inside Visual Studio for your development environment, but you can still build your Docker container. So that's built our container and successfully tagged it, as it says, as Nuxt3 ASP.NET in a container. So let's go and Docker run, and we're going to remove the container when it's finished, and we're going to port forward from port 3000 on our machine into port 80 inside the container. So as you remember, we exposed port 80 and port 443, and that's the container that we're going to run. So if I run that up, we'll see that that's now running, and this is the standard output that you get from a .NET application by default, and it's listening on port 80 inside the container. So if I come over to a web browser and go to localhost 3000, I get my Nuxt app up and running, and you can see it's calling across to the API correctly, and we're seeing that. So let's just bring up the dev tools, and on the network tab, if I do a restore there, we can see there's a call to the weather forecast and the response, and I'm getting a 200 from that. So it's calling the API weather forecast, which is being served by .NET, and our Nuxt application is coming from our www root folder within that application. So I can go to API weather forecast and actually call that API separately. So that's good. That's our Nuxt application up and running with an API running in .NET. Now let's turn our attention to the second scenario, which is hosting our Nuxt application using Vite as the web server. What we're going to do here is create a new Nuxt application for this. So we're going to start completely from scratch. So we're going to do an npx nuxt init front end. So then we can cd into that, do an npm install to pull everything down. So that's npm complete, and what I've got is a folder that's got a test API. So I'm going to unzip that. So that will create me a server folder in here. And this is just the standard blog post, blog comments API if you've not seen this before. Let's open up VS Code in here and go and take a look at what we've got. So we've got our front end, our normal app view with our Nuxt welcome. And we've added this server folder. So inside the API, we've got post, and we've got posts, so that just gives us some blog posts back, and then within an individual post for an ID we get back an individual post. So we need to go and add that, a call to that API in to our application. So I'm going to change this and just do what we normally do, which is to add in posts, and then inside the script we create a setup script with that posts, which is a reference variable, and we go and fetch from API posts. So that will call across to our server side and populates the posts with everything it gets back from that API call. So that's all we need to do. So let's npm run dev, and if we go to localhost 3000, we get our Nuxt application started, and we're seeing what comes back from that API call of all the posts that have been supplied. And again, if we do like we did before, we can F12 across and look at the API calls. So if we just do that again, we see our call to our API posts, and we can see the response of that is the content of that posts file. So we've got an application with an API that's being served as well. So let's jump back over here and see how we can get this into a Docker container. So the first thing that we need to do is exactly what we did in the other case, which is to create a new file, which is our Docker ignore, so that we can ignore anything when we do our copying around. And now this time, because we're going to run our context actually inside of our Nuxt folder, we don't need the */ so it's going to ignore any node modules folder that's directly inside this folder, any .nuxt folder, etc. So now let's go and create our Docker file, and the first thing we're going to do is build the front end. So exactly as we did in that other Docker file when using ASP.NET, we're going to get the Alpine image as front end. We're going to set the working directory to home node app, copy in our package.json and package lock.json, then do our npm install, then we copy in the rest of the application and do an npm run build on that. So that will build our application so that we would then have a .output folder, and then when we've got our output folder, we can again create a final container, set the working directory as app, and copy from front end home node app everything that's in that output folder across to /app. We expose out port 3000, and we set up a couple of environment variables so that Nuxt starts on the right port. So it starts on port 3000 and it's hosted on every single IP address that this container has. And then finally, we set the command that we actually want to execute when we start this container, which is the node and the server index.mjs. So with that in place, we can go and jump back over to our command prompt, and we can Docker build, tag it as Nuxt3 in a container, and set this folder as the context. So that's built our Nuxt3 in a container. So let's now run that container up. So again, we're going to port forward, this time from port 3000 to port 3000 inside the container, because that's what we expose. So we run that up, and if I come back over to the browser and go to localhost 3000, then we can see that we get exactly the same result that we were getting before. And we can see a call to our API posts is actually working and giving us a 200 back. So again, we can directly call the API posts, or post 1, or post whatever number, and we get our post back. So that's it. That's your Nuxt3 application running inside a container with a couple of different options for how to serve that out. But let me know in the comments, how are you hosting your Nuxt3 application? Are you using containers at all? And if you are using containers, how are you hosting yours? So with that, I want to thank you very much for watching. And if you did find this video useful, then please do hit the like button because that helps it reach more people. And if you're enjoying what you've seen on the channel, then please do think about subscribing. It does help me out. And last but not least, I need to thank the sponsors of my channel who are helping the channel grow. So thanks for that. And I will see you in the next video.